Now from there to what's going on in the Channel Sea. It's one of the biggest challenges that the British government has vowed to get on top of. Successive British governments, as they come into power, stopping smuggling gangs from constantly profitable trade and ever-continuing trade of illegal boat crossings from France to the UK over the Channel waters. Now, one that's seen the former Conservative Party deeply divided over its policies, almost exploded internally within. Plans to stop illegal stowaways, smugglers' routes, claiming it would improve after Brexit. It didn't. The numbers increased. The Rwanda plan then became a thing, sending migrants there. It didn't get off the ground. Huge legal challenges. The new Labour government are in power. The scale of that problem, the danger is ever present. 8 people dying overnight trying to cross from northern France in a poorly inflated rubber boat packed with around 60 people. A familiar story now. We're going to speak to 2 people who know this issue deeply in just a moment. First, let's hear some of the promises, the rhetoric and the fallout with different British Prime Ministers over the last decade.
We've already spent money erecting the border fence around the port at Calais. We're putting in place the border fence at Coquelles outside the tunnel. The French are sending an extra 120 police. Everything that can be done will be done to make sure our borders are secure.
The point I would just make to people thinking of making this journey, one, it is very hazardous. You may think the weather looks great, but it's a very, very dangerous thing to do. And the second thing is we will send you back.
I can tell people what I will do with them. I will put them on planes to Rwanda because they shouldn't be able to stay.
Years.
What will you do with illegal migrants who come
Honestly,
from our country? What will you do with them? It's a simple question.
His plan is
What will you do with them?
They need to be processed at the moment.
Processed?
They're not.
OK, a conversation that is still continuing. Labour now, well, in fact, as we speak, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer preparing to go to meet Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Some ideas from there. Let's go and talk to 2 people who've looked at this issue on a wide level across Europe. Andrew Geddes is in Florence, Director of the Migration Policy Centre at the European University Institute in Florence. Great to have you on the programme, Andrew. And also on my left, we've got Sally Hayden, journalist at the Irish Times in Dublin. Orwell Prize-winning author, 2 no less. Many more, I know as well, Sally, prizes that you've got, including the Prize of Ireland. My Fourth Time We Drowned is the book, you can see. Seeking refuge on the world's deadliest migration route, which focused on the Central Med route. Let's start with you, Andrew. Just listening to that conversation, the last Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and Keir Starmer, where do you stand now and what you think Labour are doing and whether they have a sense of controlling the issue?
Well, what they're proposing, or what seems to be being floated at the moment, is looking at the schemes adopted by Italy. And what Italy is doing is intercepting people at sea and sending them to Albania. Italy has not actually done anything to, no people have actually been sent to Albania at the moment. But what the UK government is continuing to look at is efforts to what could be called externalise the issue. So I think that is, and we look across Europe, and European governments have consistently sought this approach, which rather than granting territorial access to people who maybe need protection, is to look at externalising solutions, which essentially consign people to very dangerous conditions in non-EU member states. And so I think that seems to be the direction of travel with the UK government at the moment.
Sally, when you listen to the rhetoric, I mean, we had a quick potted history of 10 years. I think we can go back to probably 20 years of Calais and crossings, but actually that increase. What do you make of the way the British government over the past have tried to handle the issue, having been there over the years yourself to Calais and wider routes around Europe too?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I haven't reported so much in Calais since 2015, 2016, 2017. And at that time, I remember speaking to people who were trying to reach the UK, getting in trucks or getting in trains. And I actually asked people at that time, what about boats? Like, would you ever consider trying to cross by boat? And they all said, no, it's way too dangerous. And so the fact that people are now making this journey by boat, I think shows how desperate they are and how impossible other routes have become. And yeah, I get frustrated, I have to say, kind of seeing the rhetoric around this as painted like a kind of UK-French issue, you know, because actually we really need to look at the scale of the crises that are happening around the world. And I could talk about this for ages, but obviously we're on TV, so we don't have a lot of time. But I read that the survivors of this latest tragedy come from Eritrea, Sudan, Syria, Afghanistan, Egypt, and Iran. All of those countries have absolutely devastating crises happening right now, either regarding war, famine, or repression, you know, and crackdowns on opposition, crackdowns on freedom of speech. And without focusing this debate on the wider issues and the wider reasons why people are fleeing and the scale of the suffering and those crises, you're really missing most of the actual picture. And I think that's been one of the problems with these kind of political rhetoric, the way that politicians speak. It's not actually looking at the fact that the crisis doesn't go away just because you say, you know, we want to stop the boats or we want to tackle the smugglers or whatever. Like, smugglers are fulfilling a need. They're fulfilling the need of people who have no other ways to get to a safe place.
Andrew, is that point that Sally raises there, the idea that this has just become a movable, flowing difference to a cat and mouse game? It started as go back to 8 years, 2016, where we were talking about the trains, back of stowaway trucks as well, Eurotunnel. That changed suddenly to the boats. Now that is a lucrative model. So the platform became Stop the Boats from the Conservatives, and Labour talking about Stop the Smugglers Gang. That's their big thing. Now, if we look at it as a British-French issue, and Sally said it's far more complicated because of what's going on around the world, but to stop the gangs, when you hear that, is that a feasible method that the Labour government can actually find is achievable?
Well, it's a powerful slogan, and politics of immigration has been dominated by powerful slogans, which often led to unachievable objectives. If we look at, we can go back and we can look across the world, and the word I think which summarises many of the attempts that we're seeing at the moment is deterrence. There's a continual doubling down on policies of deterrence, but what that often does is force people into more difficult and more dangerous routes. And so the problems, in a sense, become worse. The journeys become more life-threatening. The underlying root causes, the drivers of people seeking refuge across Europe remain powerful and constant. And so the rhetoric, in a sense, is significantly divorced from some of the underlying factors which are causing people to seek refuge in Europe. And I think that what's happening at the moment is evident on a global scale in the world's major destination countries, which are seeking to deter people. And effectively what they're doing is, through the policies that they're pursuing, is turning what used to be asylum-seeking pathways or people's right to seek refuge into forms of illegal or irregular migration. In a sense, we see this illegalisation of migration. It becomes more and more difficult to secure territorial access to Europe. But that doesn't mean that the problems go away. The people who find themselves subject to extremely difficult conditions in their countries of origin, who then try to move, find it almost impossible then to secure access to Europe and, in a sense, fall into the hands of the smugglers. So the smugglers are really the symptom of a much deeper underlying set of issues.
One thing that's worth saying, because you talked, Sally, about something that go back to 2016, trains and stowaways. There was a sense, I think, at the time that there was some level of success, if that's the right word, that the British government had managed to ensure there was better policing to start to clamp down on that problem. I'll give you an example of just perhaps the scale, but also the ease to France 24 viewers and those watching of actually some of the boats and the success they've had at the moment on the shores. Go back a few years, 2018. I was investigating this, and like Sally, I spent years in documentaries on the problems in Calais. So I went to a random beach, 4 o'clock in the morning, Gravelines. It's close to Dunkirk. By 4:30, I watched 2 massive boats coming to shore, 80 people on board, children on board, tiny children. We had a decision to make. We called the police because clearly if something happened, like we heard overnight, 8 dead, what's going to happen? Within 2 hours went by, the police didn't turn up. There was no sign of them. So the argument sometimes from the British government is that this is also a policing issue. Yes, there are wider factors, and a lot of people in the UK would probably think a similar thing. Both of you, and Sally first, from your experience of covering this, how much of a factor perhaps could improve with better coordination between policing?
I mean, I think that generally when we hear the word success used by politicians or by authorities, that coincides with repression and abuse and human rights abuses of people who are trying to seek safety. And my reporting specifically has focused on the central Mediterranean, but there too we've heard politicians talking about success, and at the same time they're being implicated in likely crimes against humanity when they force people back to Libya and back to places where they're tortured and locked up and, you know, starved and abused in many different ways. And I think, again, what we're lacking is safe and legal routes, and we're lacking empathy as well. And we're kind of basically dehumanizing people. We're silencing their voices, the people making these journeys. You know, even the word migrants, I think, is kind of a distancing tactic so that we don't have to see the tragedy that's actually happening. And I'm really kind of exhausted by the fact that, you know, we're talking about policing, instead of talking about the fact that in Sudan, for example, there's been war since April 2023 and more than 10 million people are displaced.
Yeah.
Special and
Yeah, you're quite right. You're quite right. In Al Fasher at the moment, there's a big issue in the Sudanese armed forces accidentally shooting one of its own infantry bases, trying to push off against the rapid support force there. But we talk about this often. We've had guests on this. The issues, you quite rightly say, are much wider than that. And I guess for the British government challenge and why we talk about policing, and I looked at this like you, Sally, in depth, is are there measures that allow for, yes, we can talk about the government and policies of legal routes, but to stop an illegal route, Andrew, is Sally right that you shouldn't look at policing, or are they right to try to, for the sake of the lives of people trying to cross, try to improve that situation?
I suppose there's a number of aspects to this, one of which is that I suppose one of the things that is very corrosive of the politics of immigration is that for many people looking at the events that they witness in the Channel, they don't see a system. It appears chaotic. It appears that governments have kind of lost control, and that's a very difficult position for governments to be in. So an aspect of this would be around coordination, which would try to involve some coordination around border security and border cooperation, but that cannot be the only aspect of cooperation that takes place. Cooperation needs to be on a much broader footing at the borders where people in vulnerable positions need to be protected. That requires some consideration of how the UK and France could offer some protection for those who are clearly needed protection. Many of the people are coming from countries where they will have valid claims for protection, and that does need to be recognised. That needs to be part of any response, as well as the issues around cooperation on border controls, which probably are necessary if in relation to kind of public support and public consent for the policies that governments are willing to pursue. But only focusing on police cooperation is a very narrow way of looking at these issues.
It is, and I think in a context at the moment where, and Sally picked up on it, you know, we're dealing with a lot of governments that are centre-right or right-wing or even further than that, where one of the biggest issues in Europe right now is migration, that conflation between migrants and problems at home, criminality, and these issues that become, well, we saw protests over the summer in the UK at the centre of that, the places where people, migrants, were staying. Sally, you and I and Andrew can have these conversations over the years, and you must feel like others do, like I do sometimes, that you can have these similar conversations, but we're in a similar position, if not worse, later. How do you see sort of the prognosis of this migration situation in the Channel, particularly, and across Europe too, of the next 6 months to a year or so? Getting worse, or do you think governments can start to get a handle on it? Are you optimistic about Keir Starmer, for example?
Yeah, I mean, again, the way that you're phrasing this is like you're saying that success is like stopping people or repressing people more, or kind of causing a greater crash.
No, I think it's more stopping the deaths at sea, and it's stopping problems of asylum centres, migrant centres being full. It's stopping the risks that people have to take for their lives, isn't it? I think success will be the terms of people not dying, and the smugglers' routes, well, not profiting on people's lives, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think until we recognize that there's a global inequality crisis, that so many people are suffering, and that you can't not feel the ripples of that suffering, even if you're in a privileged country or a rich country, even if you're in a country like the UK that's exploited a lot of the world for centuries, you know, now erecting borders and keeping people out, it doesn't work. And yeah, I'm a journalist. I don't propose specific policy, but I do say, you know, we need to actually look at what the reality of the situation is. And only by looking at the channel and not by looking at the broader global situation, you're not going to see that reality, and you're not going to really understand how, you know, spending money on securitization and all of this, it's going to exacerbate the oppression and the suffering and the desperate measures that people will go to.
Sally, good to talk to you. Sally Hayden and Andrew Geddes as well in Florence. Great to have you both on the programme.
Thank you so much.